Hi, Hisham.
Hi, hi, Shadi. How are you doing?
Doing good, doing good. Welcome to our viewers for this Blogging Heads episode on Egypt and the aftermath of the revolution. But before we get to that, I guess we should probably introduce ourselves. My name is Shadi Hamid. I'm the Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center and a Fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. My focus is on democratic reform and Islamist parties in the Arab world. Hisham?
Nice to meet you again, Shadi. I'm H.A. Hellyer. I'm a fellow at the University of Warwick in the UK and the director of the Visionary Consultants Group, which is a research consortium looking at Muslim world development. I specialize in the politics of the Muslim world, minority-majority relations globally, the interplay between religion, modernity, and radical political violence. I'm a political commentator as well, and you can find links to the different pieces I write in the media, such as the Washington Post, at www.hellyer.com.
Sounds good. Okay, so I guess let's get started. There's certainly a lot to talk about.
Yes, there is.
How do you feel, Hisham? We should probably tell our viewers. Hisham and I are both in Cairo right now. I'm actually doing this from pretty close to the presidential palace. Where are you, Hisham?
Well, at the moment, I'm in Maadi, which is about half an hour away from downtown. But up until an hour ago, I was actually in Tahrir Square, right in the middle of it.
So, tell me how you feel. What were you up to last night when it actually happened, and how do you feel about the aftermath?
Well, last night was quite a shock for everybody in Cairo, I think. We had all been waiting with bated breath on Thursday night for the presidential speech that was due to take place, that eventually took place 45 minutes late, around 10:45 at night. And everybody was shocked. You know, the rumors that had been spread around indicated that President Mubarak was actually going to resign, and that he would probably hand over all of his authority to Omar Suleiman, who he already appointed as his vice president. But the speech was something completely unexpected. The way that it was received on the streets of Cairo was extremely negative. People were absolutely shocked that he would talk so loftily about himself and his achievements and his dedication and service to the country, and that he still addressed the people in a manner that made them feel as though they were being talked to, as opposed to talking with their commander-in-chief. And this is a man that really, I think, has been responsible for the numbers of people that came out to Tahrir Square over the past 2 weeks. And I've been talking about this with many Egyptians here in Cairo, and I think everybody agrees that there's only one man in Cairo who could have brought all those people out onto the streets, and that man was Hosni Mubarak. He was the only person that could have actually achieved that. Of course, that wasn't his intention whatsoever, but in the way that he responded to the situation at every single turn, it became inevitable that people would come out in larger and larger numbers. So, with the way that people responded to that speech on Thursday night was, first shock, then disappointment, and then anger. Anger and fury.
Yeah.
Anger and fury in that they felt that they were being baited. They felt that President Mubarak was essentially telling them, you guys can all go to hell, and I'm very happy to show you the way if you don't know.
Yeah.
And that made people very, very angry.
Well, what's so interesting here is that the mood shifted very quickly. So we have that anger and frustration on Thursday night, but then yesterday we see a total shift, and it caught a lot of people by surprise, including myself. I think after Mubarak's very defiant speech on Thursday, a lot of people thought that this impasse would continue indefinitely, and we maybe would have to deal with this for another 6 months of this back and forth and going nowhere. But the surprise announcement came yesterday, and Mubarak has stepped down, and the military has taken control over the Egyptian government. I don't know I guess you can call that a military takeover, military coup. In any case, it's a dramatic shift, and I was there in Tahrir Square when after the announcement came out, and just the beeping, the cheering, the crowd just erupted in a roar, and we're talking about certainly over a million people, at least in the surrounding areas, and such a massive group of crowd, just so much emotion just rising, and just people thrilled to see this chapter, 30 years living under this president, coming to an end.
Well, I think it was actually very interesting that the vibe that was building up on Thursday night until President Mubarak gave the speech was one of great anticipation, stress, tension. I could see that a lot in the people, and then it was a crash. It was really a psychological crash. And I know that a lot of people were expecting Friday to turn violent. I actually didn't think at all that this would be an impasse for this next 6 months. I did think it was going to turn extremely violent. And I didn't think the violence was going to come from the protesters. I thought that the protesters were going to mass in ever larger numbers, and that the defiant tone of the president's last speech indicated that he simply wouldn't tolerate their protests any longer, and that he would push them to do something that would then give him a pretext in order to use force. That was something that I really felt was going to happen yesterday. But the Egyptian people surprised us all again, because in spite of the fact that he had made such a defiant speech, as you put it, on Thursday night, and in spite of the fact that there was so much righteous anger at what he had said and the way that he had responded to this mass movement of people, in spite of all of that, they came out. They were very, very polite, very well behaved, were very well mannered, just as they've been throughout this entire episode in Egypt's history. And that's really quite astonishing. And then seeing the jubilation in the crowd. I was in Tahrir Square very shortly after the announcement, and the jubilation in the crowd, seeing this chapter completely over, in a way that they didn't really expect to begin with. They thought that they would eventually get the president to resign, but I don't think that they realized that they would get so much in that one announcement. In that one announcement, so much in Egypt changed.
Exactly.
And more beautiful for me, frankly, than yesterday was today, because yesterday was a celebration and a festival and a way to sort of say to the world, we've done it. Today was something very different. Today was a very festive atmosphere in Tahrir, but it was one where people were focusing on building Egypt again. And that was also something very, very beautiful. And for me, as I said, even more beautiful than yesterday, because today they started honoring the martyrs.
Exactly.
Yesterday was supposed to be the Friday of the martyrs, but I think really today was the Saturday of the martyrs, because they remembered their names. They had it all written down on these huge posters, and lots of different things indicating how they were actually remembering them and remembering each of their names with pictures and photos and so on. So walking around that square today was just such a beautiful exhibition of how Egyptian civil society really does exist. And it was something that I personally didn't dream was possible a few weeks ago. But coming into that square and seeing people that weren't just there to be festive, and they were festive. There were many crowds there that were there to, celebrate. But there were equally many people who had just come for the sole purpose of making sure that they had started rebuilding their country right there. And they were cleaning the streets with their own hands and their brooms and their dust pickers and their garbage bags and all sorts of chemicals that they brought in order to, polish, literally polish the pavements and paint the pavements. There were pavements that were never painted at Tahrir Square that are painted now today, and people's speeches that they were making from the microphones were reflecting that reality, not just saying, well done to us, we got rid of Hosni Mubarak, and, we're an independent free nation, etc., etc., etc. No, people were saying, now that this is done, we have to remember the sacrifices that the martyrs have made, and we have to remember what challenge we have ahead of us, and we have to remember what we have to do in order to make sure that all of this wasn't in vain.
Yeah.
So people are talking about corruption and making sure that whenever you go to a government building now, and somebody even thinks about hinting at a bribe, you make sure that that's totally out of the question,
Yeah.
and that you will not allow that cycle to repeat itself. That's the end of it. That this is a new day for Egypt and for Egyptians, and that was something very beautiful to see in the crowds.
Yeah, I was there earlier today as well, and it really felt like there was a new revolutionary spirit taking over. And I talked to some activists there to get their thoughts, and they were saying how their Egyptians are changing already. You see it in how they're acting and how they're trying to all pitch in to cleaning up the square, as you said. There was a really interesting sign that some of the workers who were cleaning up afterwards had. It said, "Yesterday I was demonstrator. Today I am building my country." And I think that
that was a very common one.
Yeah, exactly. That really captures what we're talking about. And I think what was so amazing to see about last night and today, the chants yesterday I think were very interesting. The one that you kept on hearing over and over again was, "You're Egyptian, raise your head high." And that that's what this is all about, that Egyptians were proud to be Egyptian. They were able to do something that no one expected. They created history in real time, and we saw it happening. And I think, Egyptians are offering a model to the world. The whole world is watching, and they were able to really counter. Let's keep in mind, this was a strong, in some ways, ruthless regime, and we thought that it had a broader base of support than, say, the Tunisian regime. So it felt like the odds were considerable. When the protesters started on January 25th, no one really thought they'd be able to topple this regime. The protesters surprised themselves, and they surprised everyone who was watching. And, it's really even hard to put it into words what this means for Egyptians, but also what it means for the rest of the region. And I guess we can talk about that a little bit later, whether this might lead to more of a domino effect. There's already, I think, a day of rage. There was a day of rage earlier today in Algeria, inspired in part by events in Egypt. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Hisham, I want to get your thoughts on this. We were all caught up in the euphoria. It was amazing to watch this. But part of me feels I'm a little bit worried because revolutions start off with very high expectations only to be dashed later on. And the military is in control now. The military is not a pro-democracy organization. For the last 3 decades, the military has been, in many ways, the backbone of the regime. So a military takeover is not the same thing as democracy. So I think in some ways, the coming phase is going to be just as important as the previous phase. And Egyptians really have to be vigilant to make sure the promises of this revolution are fulfilled. We don't know what the military wants. The military is sort of this black hole. There's very few people who have a really good handle on what they're thinking right now. Hisham, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's very true that over the next few weeks, months, and probably years, people are going to be disappointed by a lot of the high expectations that they had over the last few weeks, which is expected, I think, in any similar situation as this. Over the last few weeks, I've been, seeing what people expect out of this revolution. One of the first signs for me was that when you saw that people were really picking on absolutely everything that they didn't like about the country, which they linked to the state failing in some way. So I met one young man who saw a truck emit this huge amount of pollution, and he said the revolution has to take care of that. After the announcement was made yesterday, you had crowds of young men, going around Tahrir Square saying, now we're going to get married. You could see the waiters in some of the cafes say, thank God, maybe now we can actually make some money. And obviously, if you raise expectations to that sort of level where you have so many demands in order for you to consider the revolution successful, then that's going to be very difficult for people to live up to. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is that on the political front, as you said, the regime has now been replaced by a military council. And you say the military is not pro-democracy. I don't think the military is pro or anti-democracy in particular. I think that the military serves as the backbone to whatever most stable situation it can find itself within. So I think for that reason, it has always been, for the last 30 years, a strong guarantor of the government and of the regime. When it became clear that the regime could not actually maintain the control and maintain the stability that the army thought was necessary for the interests of Egypt, I think it switched sides. I think that became very clear over the last 48 hours that the army was watching closely to see what was going to happen, and decided that Hosni Mubarak cannot do the job that we need him to do for the country, which is just to keep control. Not about liberalism, not about democracy, but just to keep control. He's essentially lost the ability to keep control here. And I suspect that if we go by what's been said already with regards to the military, I think that they don't intend on keeping power. We'll see. I mean, this is a new situation also for them. It's the first time in 30 years where they actually have this sort of situation for themselves too, right?
Right.
But I suspect that based on the links that they have internationally, and we have to keep that in mind, that the army has its own political structure involved with its own international relations, and I think that the army will not want to keep power for very long. I think they will want to move to a civilian rule.
I'm glad you brought up the international component here, because I think one thing we have to remember is that there is a close relationship between the U.S. military and the Egyptian military. The U.S. gives $1.3 billion a year to it, and that matters here. And I think if we're trying to understand why the military refrained from using force against the protesters the last couple of weeks, the world was watching and the world cared. There was wall-to-wall Western coverage, and also from what we understand, senior Obama administration officials, particularly in the Defense Department and in the U.S. military, made clear to their counterparts in Egypt that massacres were not going to be tolerated, and that was a big red line for the U.S. So the military, in that sense, didn't really have a choice unless they wanted to lose one of their main sources of support and lose their credibility on the international stage. So I think the U.S., I think, as many of us know, has a pretty bad record on democracy promotion in the Arab world. But I think this is one instance where the U.S., whether it wanted to or not, actually did end up playing a constructive role in pushing the military in a more positive direction.
Well, I think that there's another aspect here in terms of the army's decision-making process, and that's that for the past 3 weeks, the army has been able to maintain this sense from the people at large that the army was either on their side or sympathetic at the very least. And this, I think, is what happened on Thursday night. People were waiting very earnestly after President Mubarak's speech and then Vice President Omar Suleiman's speech for the army to give a statement, because the army did say that they were giving a statement on Thursday night, and people were waiting up to hear that statement. And they were hoping that there was going to be a fallout between them and the regime, and they didn't hear that statement because it was never given on Thursday night. So they waited for Friday. They waited Friday morning, and then finally the statement came out, but it was right before Friday prayers, and it was essentially an empty statement, one that gave the impression to the people that they weren't going to do anything, and doing nothing in that particular situation and circumstance indicated to them compliance and agreement with what the regime had actually declared in the last two statements through President Mubarak and Vice President Omar Suleiman. So I do think that the army was particularly concerned to maintain its reputation and its connection with the people at large. And we also know that some low-ranking army officials and officers did actually leave their posts and join the protesters. I don't think it was particularly a large scale kind of movement of officers, but I think it probably worried them enough to be able to factor in their equation as well, that how long could they really keep this going with this kind of stalemate going on without having a split within the army itself on the situation. As you say, the United States does provide a huge amount of military aid to the army, so I'm sure that they also factored that into their thinking that, well, if we decide to stay with Hosni Mubarak, the United States is now making quite strong statements against him. So does that mean that they're actually going to pull our funding? They're going to pull what we really rely on in a huge way, or not? And I suspect that factored in as well. I'm not sure if it was the decisive factor, though.
Right,
to be
right.
honest.
Well, I think this is really the crucial point in revolutions: is does the police force or does the military decide to shoot into crowds, and that can really be the decisive turning point one way or the other, I think. And so...
Well, we also have to keep something in mind here. The police force in the past has shot civilians who were unarmed. Okay, we know that within Egyptian history. The Egyptian army has never fired upon Egyptian civilians, at least, not in the last 30 years. And that's a red line for them as soldiers, part of their military discipline, not to shoot at civilians and not to shoot at their own people. They were put in a very awkward situation the last 3 weeks because they were essentially given the job of maintaining public order in this country,
right.
To the point of directing traffic. This was something that they were not prepared to do.
Yeah, I think one of the major takeaways from the Egyptian revolution is that you can't repress all of the people all of the time. Once the protesters reach a critical mass, the regime is limited in how it can respond. If you have 50,000 people in a square, the regime can't arrest all 50,000. And I think Egyptians really realized that in the early days of this protest movement, that the more and more numbers they got out there, they had the momentum because of that. And the regime was always on the defensive, reacting. And that's really the story. It's a cliche, but we're really talking about people power. Yeah. And I think this goes beyond just Egypt, but I think Arabs have discovered the power they didn't really know they had up until now, that they can actually topple dictators. And that's what was so crucial about Tunisia. It really provided a cognitive shift for Arabs, that they always wanted their regimes to fall or were wishing that it could somehow happen, but they had trouble visualizing it, and now it became real to them, first with Tunisia and now with Egypt. And I think from now on, Arab regimes, the ones that are still left, are going to live in fear of the next revolt.
Well, I think there's something important here to note, that, not wanting to interrupt you, Shadi, but Tunisia was, at least, up until Egypt began, Tunisia was identified by the rest of the Arab world as being a one-off, a fluke, because of the levels of education that Tunisia has in relative to the rest of the Arab world. So after Tunisia, obviously a lot of people in Egypt, and I was here at the time, were talking about, wow, they did it in Tunisia. And people didn't think that it could happen here. Said, yeah, okay, Tunisia is a really small country. It's got a much smaller population. They're much better off in terms of their economic situation, in terms of their educational level, because of the size and so on. So it's not really comparable to Egypt. Egypt has a much more nefarious state security system. It would be very. It just wouldn't happen here. I mean, good on the Tunisians, but it wouldn't happen here. And that was the attitude that a lot of people had. And I think that when you compare that to what the situation is now, because Egypt has 40% of Egyptians live just above the poverty line. So you look at other places in the Arab world, and you can no longer say that it has to be a country that has a huge level of educational accomplishment or something like that anymore, because it could happen anywhere.
exactly. I mean, Egypt confirms what Tunisia, Tunisia provided the spark, but I think Egypt confirms that it is possible elsewhere. Hisham, why don't we move on to what is Egypt going to look like in the months and years that are to come? I think there's a lot of questions and concerns now from the U.S. I think this is something that our viewers would be interested in. We've heard a lot of alarmism about the Muslim Brotherhood, hijacking the revolution, rising to power, and all of that. And I think the general concern, Tunisia, Egypt, and whoever else is next, is that American national security interests might be under attack, and the U.S. can no longer count on allied governments to unquestioningly support its objectives and all of that. So, I think that's a big issue. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the way that we've seen how the Brotherhood behaved during this entire sort of episode shows that the future probably will not result in some sort of very strongly Islamist government in Egypt. I think that the Muslim Brotherhood will probably be a part of any future government in some way. They'll definitely get more seats in parliament than they did before, but I don't think it'll be something more than probably around 20% of the vote. And I just I don't really believe in this idea that they really are trying to grab power. To the extent that people are accusing them around the world. And this isn't to say that the Brotherhood is some sort of, liberal, cuddly kind of movement. That's not the issue. The issue is whether or not they are really a threat. And I don't really think that they are. I think that the past sort of 30 years under this government and then previous governments before it have forced the Brotherhood to shift in so many different ways, to the point where they're not quite on the same sort of level or playing field as the Turkish example, for to give one kind of example in the region with the AKP party. I don't think they're quite there, but I think that they're a lot closer to that than a lot of people would suspect right now. So I don't see them as a threat in terms of their ideology. I don't see them as a threat in terms of their popularity either. I mean, these people just overthrew Hosni Mubarak and his entire regime.
Right, right.
I don't think that they're.
I think, Hashem, I think you raise a really important point that, there is this misconception that Islamists are obsessed with seizing power, and I think this is actually one of the things that really makes it difficult to understand groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is not a political party. It's a religious movement, so it has a whole diverse array of activities it takes part in. So we have social services, education, preaching, just kind of grassroots activities. So it's not like the Democratic Party in the U.S. where it is oriented almost entirely towards the electoral cycle and political gains. The Brotherhood is a much more complex organization than that. I actually recently wrote an article in the Journal of Democracy where I actually make the argument that Islamist groups in the region deliberately lose elections. In other words, they don't run full slates. They usually operate under 50% electoral strength. Why? Because they don't want to win. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think, number one, the Brotherhood and groups like it are pragmatic organizations, and they know that if they win, the international community will have, a potentially aggressive response. The world is not ready for Islamists. We saw that first in Algeria in 91, 92, where after Islamists came to power in free elections, the U.S. and France supported a military coup. And, of course, there's Hamas coming to power in 2006. These examples loom large in the Islamist mindset. And that's what, in my conversations with Brotherhood activists the last couple of days here in Cairo, they've really emphasized this idea that the international climate is not going to be okay with Islamists coming to power in a new Egypt. And in any case, the Brotherhood has been repressed for the last several years. Their organizational infrastructure has been damaged. I think what they're probably going to do is use the next few years to really rebuild their organization, build their membership, reach out to new audiences, resolve some internal divisions, and just have the freedom really to operate. Maybe down the road they'll start to think more seriously about playing a larger role in government, but I don't think that's really the focus of the organization just yet. And again, this is a religious movement, so it's thinking about a whole range of objectives now, and not really political power.
That's true, but I also think that as the history of the Brotherhood shows, is that it's not a pure religious movement either. It is one that does focus on power, and there are different types of power, not just political power, in terms of grabbing seats at elections or taking the prime minister's post or something like that. But I do think that is part of the definition almost of Islamism as a historical sort of group of movements. But I think what's important to note in Egypt is that the Brotherhood has no intention of grabbing power without going through the ballot box. I think that's been very clear for many years. And I think it knows that at the moment, even if there were free elections, completely free elections, then it wouldn't get a majority of seats. And I don't think that they're interested in getting that at the moment either. I think that they also have a lot of soul searching to do, because for many years they've operated as a banned but tolerated movement within Egypt, and that obviously has provided them with certain strategic priorities to focus on, and others that they couldn't focus on, and that will now change. They also now have to compete with a lot of other groups in Egyptian society. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, I think, for a long time was almost a protest movement for a lot of people who voted for them and flocked towards that political sort of orientation, because it was the only thing that was out there besides the ruling party, which nobody really paid attention to, and these very small and numerically, demographically insignificant opposition groups, whereas the Brotherhood was seen to be much more of a pragmatic choice. That's no longer going to be the case. There will be many other groups that will arise out of what's happened in the last few weeks. I think we'll see new political parties emerge with different leaders and different people, and the Brotherhood will just be one of many. And the Brotherhood itself, who knows, the Brotherhood itself may split as well. We know that people left the Brotherhood years ago and formed another political party. So the future is very interesting in that regard. But I also question.
Yeah, Hisham, let me just, I'm going to have to slightly disagree with you on one point, and I know that many of my colleagues disagree with me on this when it comes to the Brotherhood. I do think if there were free and fair elections and the Brotherhood contested every district, they would win. I think there's a tendency with us in the West to look at Arabs as they're ready to burst into pro-American liberals at any moment.
Oh, I don't think that's the case at all.
I'm not saying that's what, but just to kind of, Egyptians are religiously conservative. The Brotherhood is very much in the mainstream of public opinion there. There's actually a recent Pew survey where large numbers of Egyptians support a rather strict interpretation of Islamic law on a number of issues. We can debate about what that means in practice, but the Brotherhood in the 2005 elections in Egypt won 88 seats, even though it contested only 161. So just imagine if they actually tried to contest every seat. Anyway, but I think the more important point here is one that you point to, is that the Brotherhood has been in opposition the last 80 years. This is the first time it really has to think about what it means to offer a more positive, forward-looking vision. What does it mean to govern? What does it mean to translate this vague notion of Islamism into a program that works? And I think if even the Brotherhood itself doesn't really have a good idea of what that means, and maybe that's yet another reason why they're reticent to rule, because they don't really know what they do. And I think there would also potentially be internal splits, maybe not so much over domestic policy, but I think the real point of contention within the Brotherhood is how to deal with the Israel issue. And there's been a lot of debate about this. Would the Brotherhood cancel the peace treaty? and things of that nature. And I think the important point here is the bottom line: Arabs don't like Israel, Egyptians don't like Israel, so any democratically elected government, whether it's Islamist or not, is going to be less amenable to Israel's interests and so on. So I think that is actually a legitimate concern. I think there are ways to mitigate that. I don't think any new government would really want to be on the U.S. and international blacklist by causing tensions along the border with Israel. Egypt also receives considerable aid. Does it want to lose that aid right away, especially when the focus now will be on rebuilding the nation? So in the end, it's not really about what you believe. So Islamists may, in their heart of hearts, wish that Israel wasn't there, but I think it's a whole different story when someone's in a position of responsibility, and we're talking about a pragmatic organization
Sure.
that has been willing to compromise on its ideology before, and this is actually something we've heard from some Brotherhood leaders the last couple of weeks, where they've actually said publicly, we're willing to respect the peace treaty. Granted, not all of them have said that, but there's definitely been a number that have. And I think that really shows that the Brotherhood is willing to make serious
Well, I
compromises.
think there are a few things here. The first is just to go back to the previous point without belaboring it too much, because we'll both see what happens when the elections actually take place. But I think that it's been shown just in the last few weeks that Egyptians can be religiously conservative without being Islamist or support Islamist parties, and I think that's been very clear in how the crowds have turned out. And we know that they weren't all Brotherhood crowds by far, and yet we did see huge numbers at the prayers. We did see women in hijab. We saw those sort of signs that these are religiously conservative individuals, but they're not necessarily Islamists by far. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect, I think that one thing that the United States has to remember in this whole scenario is that the United States has many allies in the world that are democracies. And they're allies, and they don't necessarily agree on everything. Coming from the UK, I know that the UK doesn't agree with every policy of the United States, and many Britons would wish that it would make that more, well known. But the UK and the United States aren't about to go to war because, as two democracies, they disagree with each other. And I think that that's something that Americans will also have to realize, that the fact that Egypt is now a democracy, yes, may mean that there are going to be disagreements on a variety of issues, but disagreements don't necessarily have to mean that they're going to be enemies either. There will be concerns, I'm sure, over the fact that bordering Egypt is a state that most Egyptians are not particularly happy with over its treatment of the Palestinians. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a running sore within the entire region, and it actually goes beyond the region to the broader Muslim world, and that's a situation that has to be resolved if we're to see, true peace in this region, and to, stop any threat of annihilating, I think, this whole region completely. But how that happens and how it doesn't is going to be very interesting. I don't think that you will find Egypt turning into some sort of ideologically revolutionary state. I think it will continue to be a very pragmatic one. And I think that the Brotherhood will actually change itself in that regard, because it will realize that if we're now we're outside of the realm of dictatorial regimes, but within a dictatorship, the game is easier because the rules are fewer. Don't do anything,
Right.
Whereas now we're entering a new phase where they will be in the same sort of situation, I think, as a country like Indonesia. And Indonesia went from Suharto to a completely different system in a very short amount of time. And most Indonesians don't have particularly good feelings about Israel either. And you can see that in the literature and the media and so on. But the national interests of Indonesia meant that they took a particular line towards Israel. And I wouldn't be surprised if that happened here. I'm sure that Egypt will play a much more aggressive role in terms of speaking on behalf of the Palestinians, just on the basis.
Oh, that's Hisham. That's going to frighten a lot of people. Be careful.
Well, aggressive in the sense that a lot of people in this country do support the rights of the Palestinians in their conflict with Israel. I don't think that they're going to go that far out of the box, though. I think that they'll continue to support the two-state solution. I don't think that that's going to change. I think that they will definitely try to seek some sort of resolution around the refugee problem, and I think that they will be very keen to ensure that any solution around Jerusalem is to the Arab consensus. And in that regard, I don't know how much actually is going to be different between Egypt's position and the position of many countries around the world. I don't think there'll be war. I definitely hope not. But I do think that Israel in the region will also have to realize that as the future progresses, these countries are going to become more and more responsive to their populations. And if that's the case, then Israel will also need to take that into account as it develops its own foreign policy strategies. I wouldn't be one to predict what would happen, but perhaps that might actually mean that the peace process becomes restarted again because Israel will recognize that it can't rely on the same variables remaining anymore. And we may actually see that this works out to everybody's benefit. And who knows, we may actually see that dream of the Greater Middle East coming true after all.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we might be seeing is really a pan-Arab democratic moment, and I think there really is an opportunity for the U.S. to get on the right side of this and align itself with Arab popular aspirations. I mean, the U.S., there's been all this talk about U.S. influence declining in the Middle East. I think now there is an opening for the U.S. to recast its relationship with the Arab world and fundamentally reorient its foreign policy, because up until now, it's been based around these so-called stable autocratic regimes. But what we've seen with Egypt and Tunisia is the end of the stability paradigm. And I hope that the U.S. now understands that. And now they can really push forward and be with Arab populations. So it's no longer going to be the U.S. siding with regimes against their own citizens. And that can totally change how Arabs perceive the U.S. in terms of America's credibility in the region. I think it's worth noting, I don't know if this has been reported widely, but President Obama's, I think it was either his first or second speech about Egypt, where he said the transition must begin now and emphasized the now. That was played through much of Tahrir Square, and applause broke out.
Yeah.
People were excited to hear Obama saying that. So as much as there is anti-Americanism in the region, there's still a sense that Arabs look to the U.S. for more leadership. They may not expect to get it, and they're likely to be disappointed, but there is still a sense that the U.S. has the potential to play a better, more constructive role in the region. And I think we as Americans should recognize that and run with it. People are looking for leadership right now. And I think, at least on the issue of democracy, the U.S. is well placed to be on the right side of this. Egypt will have to organize free and fair elections for the first time in more than 6 decades. The U.S. can provide the kind of assistance and expertise that may be necessary to actually make that happen.
Well,
there are a lot of areas where the U.S. can help in facilitating Egypt's democratic transition. And if it does that, and if Egyptians see America as helping on that front, that's going to change the relationship right there in a really important way.
I suspect, though, to be honest with you, Shadi, I'm not American myself, so I'm kind of neutral on that point. But my observation of the square in the past 2 weeks hasn't been one of anti-Americanism, but one of really defiant independence. So you saw a lot of people making comments on the internet, as well as creating signs around Tahrir Square, essentially telling the Americans to mind their own business. And while I think that there would be a lot to be gained from American expertise on a variety of issues. I also think that the mood on the street at the moment is that America played a good role in the past few days, but it has also been the friend of the dictator that they've tried to overthrow for the last 3 decades. And while President Obama's speech was very widely respected in the region, I think that people will be waiting now to see if he's really going to restart that relationship. And the Egyptians have long memories when it comes to these sorts of things. So I do think there's an opportunity here, not just for the United States, but for the West as a whole. I think that in the European reaction to these events has been very interesting. I know my own government in the UK has given a number of statements that were very well received here. But I also think that Egyptian society at large is very easily suspicious of foreign interference. And you saw that very plainly over the last few weeks, seeing how quickly rumors would spread around the involvement of foreign agents within Egypt. So there is that feeling of suspicion as well. But we can only hope that as this new sort of era in Egyptian history unfolds, that we will find that there'll be many more opportunities for collaboration. And I think that on a social level and on a cultural level, more than anything else, Egyptians have shown over many years that they're very friendly towards the United States. And I think on the political issues that they may find themselves to be in some tension, that there will be avenues in which that they can sit down together as partners on these different issues and discuss ways forward. And I think that our listeners that, on this program need to keep that sort of thing in mind, that Egypt is a partner in the Middle East of anybody who I think wants good for this region. And Egypt has always been that country that is almost indispensable in terms of getting things done in this region, for good or for worse. And as the future unfolds, a democratic Egypt, one that a regime that really does represent its citizens, I think can only be good news.
Yeah, I think that's really the key point here. The only real guarantee for long-term stability, I think, is democracy. Yes, there may be some short-term trade-offs, but in the end, democracies provide stability, and we've seen that in many other parts of the world. What we do know is that the status quo, and it's not even the status quo anymore, of Arab autocratic regimes is falling apart, and we can't return to the way things were before. The Arab world is never going to be the same after January 25th and after February 11th. And I think we're talking about potentially one of the great historic moments. Granted, it's still too early to tell, and as we said earlier, revolutions sometimes, or really often, disappoint. But that's where I think the international community really has to do whatever it can to help Egyptians realize their aspirations here, not in an interventionist, imposing way, but in a constructive way, as you said, as partners. And I think on that note, Hisham, I think we're going to have to close this episode of Blogging Heads. I think it's good that we ended on a positive note. So from Cairo, goodbye.
Goodbye, Shadi, and goodbye to you listeners. Have a good evening.
You too.